Verbum Magia Part 3. It was cold, creeping sensation crawling down my spine that woke me. I instinctively tried to twitch away from it, but found that I couldn't move. My eyes opened and my head throbbed in the bright light. I let out a low moan as my body painfully reminded me that I hadn't fallen asleep, but rather had been knocked unconscious. My jaw ached and the feeling down my spine had changed from an almost cold tingle to a hot burning. I tried once again to move myself, but I was strapped into a chair. It was similar to the one that I'd been sitting in for my assessment, insofar that it was reclined, and the elven woman was standing at my head again. Uh-oh. I hissed in pain from both my jaw and spine, and the woman casually looked down at me. Her brown hair dangled in tiny braids nearly to my face. "Awake, are we?" she asked, her voice lilted and low. "Let me go," I said, or I tried to. My mouth opened and I felt myself enunciate the words, but no sound came forth. There was only a slight wheeze where the words should have been. The woman's mouth curled into a cold smile and she chuckled. I tried to speak again, but only a second wheeze and the burning in my spine flared painfully. "That's what I thought. Drew, was it?" She patted my cheek in the manner of an adult to a child, only I was sure that there was a handprint left behind from the force of it. "I don't know how you know our ancient language, but you shall not utter another word of it, or any other word." She seemed like she was about to start laughing at my discomfort, looking down on me strapped to the chair. "Ortho here wanted to cut your tongue out," she said, motioning to the orc who'd knocked me unconscious. "I am a little more, restrained than that." I blinked at her, horrified at the thought of missing my tongue. Almost instinctively, I curled it towards the back of my mouth and clamped my jaw shut. "Rather, I have simply bound your vocal cords with Verbum Magia." She paused, as if waiting to see how I would respond to this. I couldn't respond much, as bound to the chair as I was, and as well vocalless as I was. Instead, I just stared at her, my brown eyes locked with her own green. Apparently, that was a response enough, as she laughed outright. The noise echoed loudly in the small room, and for the first time I noticed that we were not in one of the tree buildings, but one of the strange stone ones. This room, as far as I could see, had no windows, and the only light source was a glowing ball of light that hung high in the air. "Now, Drew, let's get back to assessing you, shall we?" She lowered her hands to either side of my head. Eyes wide, I struggled against my bonds. I didn't want to forget, and I didn't want to be just another slave. She ignored me, my attempts not even enough to move the chair or myself an inch. "Reveal to me the nature of this soul. Show to me the..." Her hands started to glow again, and the magic felt hot against my skin. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing and on tuning her out. Maybe if I just focused on me, I would be okay. As my jaw throbbed and I felt the magic around me, I groaned again. How had I gotten into this position? Dying was supposed to send you to heaven or hell, not whatever the fuck this place is. Guide me through his life's history. It wasn't working. I couldn't tune her out, and that stupid little part of me was stuck listening to her Latin and wondering why she spoke the way she did. Their Latin was a little more archaic than what I'd learned, but it was intelligible. My skin crawled and I gave up trying to focus on me. Now I was focusing on her magic. Her eyes were closed and her brow was furrowed slightly. The magic burned, but not in a "I'm on fire" kind of way. More like a "my legs have been asleep for hours and are just getting the blood flow back" kind of way. The room was silent except for her chanting and Ortho's loud breathing. I could hear my heartbeat, and I wondered what exactly she was getting out of this. She hadn't told me to forget yet, and for the most part, I was just sitting here, waiting. When her green eyes once again opened, she lowered her hands and frowned down at me. She didn't look nearly as angry as she had before she started, and honestly, that scared me more than if she'd glared at me again. Instead, she looked thoughtful, and here I was nearly shaking in my seat. "Aren't you about done yet, Yona?" Ortho asked, his voice gruff as if talking around the two large tusks in his mouth was nearly impossible. The elf looked up at the orc, annoyed. She huffed slightly and crossed her arms looking at him rather than me. "Yes. Just thinking of a name. He'll be going to the archives. It's been a long time since I saw anyone with quite a thirst for knowledge." "Do you really think that's a good idea? With him being able to use Verbum Magia?" I couldn't quite turn my head far enough to look at Ortho comfortably, but from the corner of my eye, I saw him shift from one foot to the other nervously. He can't speak, I've made sure of that. She motioned dismissively. Without that, why would it matter what he reads as well? And if he doesn't do his job well, he'll be punished, just like the rest of them. She turned back to me. You'll be a good boy, won't you, Ian? I wanted to groan. The name was so bad. Drew certainly wasn't exciting or unique, but it was my name. My hesitation to nod, I didn't really have another way to answer her, caused her to bend over me, nearly nose to nose, her hair falling around my face. You are Ian, she said. I could feel the magic burning inside me hotter than anything else so far. I felt my very soul deny what she said. I wasn't Ian, I was... Who was I, if I wasn't Ian? She straightened once again and, looking me straight in the eye, repeated, You'll be a good boy in the archives, won't you, Ian? I swallowed tightly but nodded. Ortho came over and unstrapped me from the chair. I wasn't sure if the burning feeling coursing through my arms and legs was residual magic or simply the blood flowing back into them unrestricted. Time to go to your assignment then, Ian, Ortho said with a sneer, leading me out of the room. I chanced to glance back at Yona, but she turned away from me, looking at a desk I hadn't been able to see while laying down. I wasn't sure what exactly she'd learned from me or about me during the session, but I was being released. Without the ability to speak, and with possibly less freedom than I'd gone in with. At least she'd let me keep my memories so far. Enjoying the story? Don't forget to subscribe and comment. Your support helps us create more stories just for you. All right, let's continue the story. Verbum Magia Part 4. Ortho led me outside, not even bothering to make sure that I was following him. My feet dragged, and I found myself looking at the strange building. I felt both exhausted and wired, and could hear the blood rushing through my ears. I could run, could just stop walking, and I doubt Ortho would even notice. But then what? It's not like I have anywhere to go. I literally died and had been transported to this hellhole. I didn't know where I was or how far the town I was in extended. Say I ran, then what? I didn't know what plants were edible. I didn't know how to hunt. I'd be dead in no time. How quickly depended on if there were things in this world that could kill me or if I'd starve to death. So I kept walking, following the ugly puce-colored orc to my new home, the archives. I shook my head, disgusted at myself. Had I not wished for just that before my assessment had started? Yet here I was, voiceless. I still could not fucking believe that in whatever weird fantasy world I'd ended up in, Latin was the magic language. I could have just let Yona assess me, sent me on my way, and experimented with magic on my own, but oh no, not me. I had to try to use it immediately and get my voice stolen. I rubbed my neck subconsciously while glaring at Ortho. At least Yona had stopped him from cutting my tongue out. As we walked between a series of the stone buildings with tree buildings butting up in every space between, I wondered where exactly the archive was. Down one street, then another, elves, dwarves, and orcs all glared at me. There were only a handful of humans, each staring at their feet as they walked, focused only on the task they were set upon. I wanted to tell them that they too could use magic, if only they spoke the correct language, but I did not have a voice to tell them with. Not that it mattered. Each of them looked like they'd made peace with their lots in life, and would have ignored me anyways. After nearly 10 minutes of walking, if I was to be any judge, it wasn't like I had a watch anymore, we finally arrived at our destination. It was another of the floating cavern buildings, and easily the largest I could see. Story after story rose defiantly from the ground, daring gravity to have any effect on it. There were also no windows or even doors that I could see. The claustrophobe within me shuddered, but I continued to follow Ortho. He walked right up to the stone, and for the first time since I'd landed in this strange world, I heard a nun-elf use magic. Open, he said to the wall, and a section seemed to shimmer for a second. The word sounded thick in his mouth, as if he struggled to get the pronunciation right. Then he turned to me, tusks coated in saliva, and said, Inside. I looked between him and the shimmering rock and nearly dove headlong inside. I lost my balance, trying to get away from the orc, and tumbled onto the smooth stone floor inside. Ortho just walked in behind me and grunted in displeasure of seeing me on the ground. Before I could stand, two elven men were approaching. Tall and willowy, their noses were scrunched as if they smelled a bad odor. I vaguely wondered if it was me or Ortho they found so repulsive. After a moment and seeing the way their eyes darted between me and him, I got the distinct impression it was both of us. "What is this?" one of the two asked, looking down on me. He was standing slightly ahead of the other and had his long arms crossed in front of his chest. His long brown robes hung perfectly straight, not even swaying as he breathed. "Assessor Yona has found this human to be suitable for your needs," Ortho grunted out, obviously ready to walk back out the door, which from this side was just an open portal to the outdoors. "We did not request another aid," the other said, his black eyes darting angrily to me and then to Ortho. Ortho gave a half shrug and started to turn away. "I am not the assessor. She has decided he belongs in the archive, so I have brought him to the archive." Completing his motion, Ortho was nearly at the door when he looked back and said, "His name is Ian. He's a mute." With that, he stepped out the portal, and the rock that had shimmered from the other side solidified itself back into the wall. "Get up," the first elf said, staring down at where I still laid sprawled on the ground. The same burning sensation that I'd felt when Yona had used magic on me burned in my legs as they nearly twisted themselves trying to obey the command. The second elf turned and left, while the first stood waiting on me to find my feet. When I'd finally stood, he walked away, and I took it to mean that I was supposed to follow him. Down magically lit corridors we went, and I desperately tried to remember what turns we made and what staircases we climbed, but it jumbled itself in my mind and I was hopelessly lost before we arrived at our destination. A small room with a cot and a small stack of robes seemed to be for me. The elf stood back so that I could enter, then stepped back in the doorway. "Another servant will help you learn your duties tomorrow. After that, you are expected to perform as expected. If you do not, you'll be punished. Fail us enough and we'll send you away. You were not needed anyways." Then he was gone. I sat on the cot and looked around. There was a single ball of light near the doorway. I didn't know what I'd expected, but this wasn't it. Through all the hallways we'd walked, I hadn't seen a single book. I stood and peered out into the hallway. Dimly lit with glowing balls of light spaced just slightly too far apart, it was filled with more rooms like this one. Nearly all were empty from what I could see, though if it was because their inhabitants were working, or if they were abandoned, I didn't know. I sat back on the cot and found myself annoyed at a lack of a door. Then I laughed. Or I tried to, but no sound came forth other than a breathy grunt. Here I was, annoyed at the lack of a door, when the night before I'd been sleeping in a barracks-type room filled to the rim with people. I shook myself once more, then laid down on the small cot. It was narrow, with my arms just resting by my sides without them falling off, but long, much longer than it perhaps needed to be. Elves were tall, of course, but I had a good 2 feet of spare room in that direction. It was stiff, and as I rolled to my side, I could hear the wood it was made of creak in complaint. But it didn't matter. I was tired, and being knocked unconscious aside, hadn't slept well in days. Longer even. Not since I'd died. So as I lay there, eyes closed and arm tucked under my head as a pillow, I drifted off to sleep, unworried of who or what would wake me next. When I woke up next, I momentarily forgot where I was. The light, not bright enough to be bothersome in sleep, cast strange shadows in the small room. It took a few groggy eye blinks to figure out that the shadows were coming from a figure standing at my feet. Another human, dressed in robes similar to the ones the elves had worn, but less adorned and the material far more coarse. I said, "Get up," the woman, for the figure had resolved itself into a woman, said for what must have been at least the second time. I sat upright, staring at her. She was older, perhaps nearer in age to my mother than myself. Plump and steel-haired, she was looking down at me in displeasure. "Get dressed. We'll be late to breakfast if you don't get a move on," she said, folding her arms. I stood and looked around, seeing that I'd kicked my own set of robes onto the floor as I slept. I grabbed them, and they hung limply in my hand as I looked at her once again. She showed no intention of leaving, nor could I ask her to. With a sigh of embarrassment, I turned my back to her and quickly stripped off the clothes I'd worn since I'd first arrived and pulled the robes over my head. When I turned around, hoping that she'd turned away, I found her still glaring at me. "Come this way now, and remember where we are. I won't be showing you around again." She was out the door and down the corridor before I could bring myself to move. A quick glance over my shoulder, and I found myself moaning in annoyance. I'd never remember where my room was. Every corridor in this godforsaken place was identical, strangely smooth walls with precisely placed glowing lights. Every connecting hallway seemed to be a four-way stop, every direction a mirror of the others. Miraculously, we ended at a large room with low benches that had food laid out. There were half a dozen other humans in the room, all dead-eyed and focused solely on their meals. None looked up at me, and no one moved for me to have a place to sit. Shuffling myself awkwardly into a corner, I reached out and grabbed one of the empty bowls and took small portions of the scrambled eggs and what looked like oatmeal, only a shade of burnt orange. As each person finished, they rinsed their dishware in a bucket of water and laid them out to dry. Then they were out the door, each intent on their own duties for the day. The woman who'd led me here ate quickly, and once she'd finished, stood looming over me, not speaking, but clearly wanting me to hurry. Shoveling the rest of the orange glop, which I'd found to have no real flavor, into my mouth, I stood and rinsed my dishes. The woman walked out the door, not waiting for me once again. I jogged to catch up with her, and found that we were headed down a dizzying staircase that, if my sense of up and down were correct, was below the massive building. Maybe these buildings were caves after all, raised above ground for some unknown reason. As we exited the stairwell, I found myself standing flabbergasted, staring ahead. Hundreds of thousands of books sat on stone shelves that towered high into the air. The light here was not attached to any wall or ceiling, rather floating between long shelves. The few people in the room that I could see, each seemed to have their own small light following them as they walked. My fingers itched to grab the nearest book, but I stood still, waiting for the woman to tell me what to do. I also wondered if she was going to introduce herself, or if I'd just be left to call her the woman in my head forever. It's not like I could introduce myself either, though. I instinctively tried to shove my hands into my pockets to keep them busy, only to find that these robes, just like my previous clothing, didn't have any. Noticing my motion, the woman turned to look at me. You'll be responsible for several things here. First and foremost, anytime an archivist asks you to do something, you do it. I don't care if it's kissing their asses or wiping their boots. You do it. If you don't, you'll be beaten. I would tell you not to talk back, but I've been informed you can't speak at all, so instead I'd say, keep your expressions on your face neutral. She motioned forward towards a stack of scrolls and books. Next, you, along with myself and others, are responsible for putting literature back on the shelves where they belong. She pointed to a colored string that hung from each item. You match the string with the shelf. Primary color is section, secondary is the shelf, tertiary is the final position. She grabbed one that had a large red section, a smaller green section, and then a white dot. She led me between shelves, and at one point I noticed that we too had gained our own personal lights. I noticed, due to the fact that the shelves cast long shadows between each aisle, an unnatural darkness lurking in the corners. When we reached our destination, she laid it lightly on the shelf, then turned back the way we'd come. Honestly, I was disappointed in the system. It lacked the fineness that the Dewey Decimal System had. It worked, I supposed, but unless you knew what you were looking for, there'd be no way to find it. You'll also be transcribing older records, the woman was saying, and that caught my attention. It seemed that they used an alphabet very similar to the one I'd grown up using. While a little difficult to read for some of the consonants, I definitely managed to read fire in the notes I'd seen laying around Yona's office before. I wanted to ask questions, but the woman just continued on, oblivious, and I was stuck there walking behind her, mouth open like some sort of demented goldfish. She spent the rest of the morning telling me and showing me how to do various tasks. She never asked if I needed more instruction, and I didn't think it was because I couldn't answer. The afternoon, she led me back to the room we ate in, and then back to the archive. After lunch, she simply said, "Your turn," and watched as I replicated the tasks she'd done that morning. The only interruption was whenever an elf would pass by, she'd stop and bow low to them, and after the first elbow, I realized I was supposed to, as well. I had no idea of how much time was passing, and when she finally said, "Enough," I found that my stomach was gurgling with hunger and that my eyes were burning with exhaustion. I followed the woman for the last time that day to the meal room and then was left to find my room on my own. Belly almost full and thoughts of sleep had me confused and bumbling my way around the identical corridors looking for the cubby that was mine rather than someone else's. What I didn't expect to find was a locked door with angry voices yelling behind it. What does a session think that they're doing? Sending another human here? One of the voices said. I stopped, looking down both ends of the corridor before stepping closer to the door. I thought I recognized the voice as belonging to one of the elves from the night before. Yona should have known better. We have a limit for a reason. He isn't needed here. I'm sure he would have done quite well in the fields. That was definitely the other elf that I'd met. Tora said that she showed him the ropes today. If he didn't learn, then we'll punish him. Perhaps a little too much. Rid ourselves of him now. I blanched and stepped away. I would definitely be doing my very best then. Starting with finding my room, I turned and left, back the way I'd come. Maybe I'd made a left where I should have made a right. Several hours later, and I'd finally found my room. But rather than stop and sleep, I'd started tracing the path there and to the mess back and forth, trying desperately to memorize it. I only stopped when one of the elves saw me and asked what I was doing. I opened my mouth to tell him that I was just trying to remember where to go, but no sound emerged. Frustrated, he simply told me to get back to my room, and I did. Thank you for listening to the story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter. Your support means a lot.